Welcome to this BRCGS webinar on Food Safety Issue 8, 1 year on. I'm John Figgins, I'm the Technical Specialist for Food with BRCGS, and I'll be completing today's webinar. We thought that as audits to the standard started last February, this was a good occasion for us to review and put out some new information about what's been learnt about the standard and the requirements during the first year of audits. And so we thought today we would start with some background, just some reminders about what the standard was designed to do and where it is, and also to think about some of the top non-conformities. I don't like to concentrate too much on the negatives of the non-conformities, but sometimes by talking about them, we can have some very interesting learnings which are useful for sites. We'll take the opportunity to talk through the current position statements, a reminder about those. Everyone should be familiar with them, but just to ensure that that is understood. And then just at the end, we've got a couple of slides just about looking forward to things that will happen shortly and making sure that everyone's familiar with those. So let's start with some background. The standard was published in August 2018. It's important that from time to time we routinely review the standard, and where relevant we ensure it's up to date. The first issue of the standard was originally published in 1998, and if we were still using that standard, it would not really be meeting the needs of modern industry. And therefore it's important that these reviews take place. And that resulted in us updating and, as I say, publishing in August 2018. And then for the audits to the new standard to start in February 2019. That gap between publication and first audits is deliberate to make sure everybody has time to prepare, to review their current systems, to receive training, and making sure that they're all ready for the new issue of the standard. So now we've had about 10 months worth of audits, we can look at the standard in more detail. We can look at what people have been finding. Now, there were a whole series of key changes that we made to issue 8, and we actually published a whole guideline on those changes. But we can't go through every single one of those changes today, but we're going to concentrate on particular sections. We're going to concentrate where there were the big changes and where the most non-conformities have occurred. So we'll particularly be speaking about some of the clauses in senior management commitment and in some of the site standards as we go through and look at them. Now, you will be aware, because many of you are using our Insight tool, that it allows us to analyze our audit data. It allows us to be able to look at non-conformities, for example, to see where they're occurring, how frequently they're occurring, how many audits they're occurring in. And during the first 10 months, we obviously have done that analysis and had a look at each of the non-conformities. And what I'm proposing to do, first of all, is talk through some of those key learnings. So if we start with the top non-conformity, the most common non-conformity for issue 8 so far has been minor non-conformities against clause 1.1.2. That was that brand new requirement on food safety culture. We've not had food safety culture in the standard before as a requirement, and therefore it was very new to people. Although culture had been talked about for several years, many sites hadn't tried implementing a culture plan before. Of course, it should be noted that the BRCGS auditor is not auditing the actual culture at the site. that would be outside the scope of the audit. But the auditor will be looking to find out whether the site has a plan and whether that plan contains everything it should and whether that plan is being implemented correctly. Okay, so if we look at what a culture plan needs to be. First of all, a site needs a specific culture plan for their business, for their site. It needs to be site specific because they need to consider activities that are relevant for their site. Since the auditor will be looking to audit it, this must be a documented item where the site has collated the information that is relevant and that they intend. There are a number of things that need to be in this plan, and the first of these is that they must define some activities. They must think about what will be done, what will be achieved to try and improve the product safety culture at that site. And that, of course, is why the plan needs to be site-specific. The industry have talked about some really good ideas, and there's lots of information available about things that could be put into a plan, but the site management needs to consider whether or not they are relevant for their site. For example, considering what they're already doing and considering where their product safety culture already is. Once they've defined the activities, they must work out how to implement the activities. How will these things be done? Who will be involved? And then set some timescales and consider when things will be done. They may be short-term, intermediate term, long-term activities. And obviously, once they set the timescales, they must have a mechanism for actually doing what they've said they will do in the timescales. And then, after an activity has been completed, there are some measurement and feedback mechanisms. Do the management involved get some sort of communication or feedback? Do they have some sort of measure to understand whether an activity was worthwhile, whether culture is evolving? And then the final bullet point of the clause is about assessing effectiveness. That's the one that I've put the big green arrow against. Now, when we originally published the standard, we made the point that an auditor couldn't assess effectiveness until some activities had been completed and until sites have actually done that effectiveness assessment. And therefore, we indicated that auditors wouldn't look at effectiveness until the second issue 8 audit at the site. Obviously, we're now in January 2020. Second audits to issue 8 will start on the 1st of February. So it's important that sites make sure they have been assessing effectiveness of the activities that they have completed. Obviously, good practice is to assess effectiveness as soon after an activity is complete as possible, because then it's fresh in everybody's minds, and then it gives the opportunity for the plan to evolve immediately where that's relevant. But certainly by the second audit, the auditor will be expecting to see those effectiveness assessments being complete and being in place. And that's an important part of the process because, of course, a plan should evolve. It's no good to keep doing the same thing if that thing isn't working. And likewise, if something is successful, then, of course, the site's culture will have evolved, in which case new or different or evolving activities will be required. So that was the requirement of the standard, and we found over the year lots of sites have had non-conformities against different aspects of this, whether they haven't defined the activities correctly, whether they haven't implemented them or they've set timescales and then not implemented them. Small factors that are not there. We have also, of course, found some sites who didn't have a plan in place by their first audit. Just to re-emphasise, the auditors are not attempting to audit the culture at the site, but will be looking at the plan, whether the plan is in place, and whether the site has implemented the bullet points. And also to emphasise that that last bullet point on effectiveness will be assessed from the second issue 8 audit at the site onwards. It's worth mentioning that we did publish a position statement on this particular clause, just to make it clear. And the reason for that was right at the beginning, there was some discussion about whether non-conformities should be major or minor non-conformities. So if we look at the definitions of non-conformities that are given in the standard, a major non-conformity is where there is a substantial failure to meet the requirements of a statement of intent or any clause of the standard, or a situation is identified which would, on the basis of available objective evidence, raise significant doubt as to the conformity of the product being supplied. Whereas a minor is defined as where a clause has not been fully met, but on the basis of evidence, the conformity of the product is not in doubt. And so at the beginning of the audits to the standard, there was some discussion on the correct level of non-conformity for clause 1.1.2. And therefore, we clarified the situation in a position statement. In summary, if a site doesn't have a documented product safety plan at all, that is a substantive failure to meet the clause. And that, of course, as we've just mentioned, matches the definition of a major non-conformity. Where a site has a culture plan, but there are smaller errors, for example, some missing information, some elements of poor implementation, or some elements of poor assessment processes, then this is more likely to meet the definition of a minor non-conformity. By way of extra assistance for sites and for auditors, we have published a separate webinar on food safety culture that goes through the requirements that we've just highlighted in even more detail than we have today. And it also provides lots of examples of activities and the types of things that a site might want to try to improve their product safety culture. It's not a definitive list, but it does give ideas for those who are struggling to find good mechanisms and good things to do to develop food safety culture. That webinar is available both on the BRCGS Participate platform and on our website. So if we look at the next set of non-conformities, we find that there are several non-conformities that relate to clauses that are not new. These clauses were also in issue 7, but are still proving challenging for sites to ensure compliance with. The first of these is clause 2.7.1. That's the hazard identification clause. A site is expected to list all the relevant hazards within the HACCP plan, and that, of course, is to ensure that they are all considered within the later steps of the hazard assessment to make sure that any possible hazards have been managed correctly. We did restructure this clause slightly to make sure that it was absolutely clear, and to make sure that it was clear that hazards might relate to things like physical contaminants, microbiological problems, chemical contaminants, allergen management, radiological concerns, and perhaps it's that restructuring, particularly on making it clear that chemical and radiological are there, that has perhaps meant that a few sites have needed to review their hazard identification to make sure all possible hazards have been suitably covered. That doesn't mean to say that every single hazard will result in a CCP, but that every single hazard has been considered and assessed as part of the hazard process, so that if challenged, the site will know that it has appropriate procedures in place. The next clause that we see occurring relatively frequently is clause 4.11.1, and this is about the cleanliness and hygiene of equipment and of the premises. Obviously, during the audit, the auditor will look at documentation associated with the cleaning processes, both in terms of the procedures, the assessment of what's necessary, and the records that has occurred. But also, when the auditor is on site, particularly when they're in areas such as the production areas, they will be asking for equipment such that it's not being used at the time, to see whether it's been cleaned, to see whether the procedures have been followed correctly, and we'll always have one eye on this as they are in the production areas. Obviously, it won't be relevant for equipment that's in use at the time, because if product is on the equipment, you would expect that product to be contaminating the line, and the auditor won't stop the line to watch it being cleaned. But where there is equipment or line that is not currently being used, or areas of the site that are not being used, the auditor is likely to ask the site to demonstrate how they have met the procedures and the standards that they have identified in their documentation as being necessary. The next clause that occurs on the list of common non-conformities is clause 4.6.1. Now, this is about equipment, its construction, its ongoing maintenance, to ensure it does the correct job in the correct way, in a way that produces safe product of the right quality, and also to manage things like ongoing maintenance so that it continues to do that, and the question of wear and tear. So is it possible that any piece of the equipment will wear out? Is it possible, for example, that plastic components might be damaged, and therefore a process of maintenance and check-in that ensures that there isn't a physical contaminant, perhaps a piece of plastic, for example, as a result of wear and tear that should have been managed as part of the ongoing maintenance. The fifth most common non-conformity is about clause 4.4.1, and this is about walls, and particularly, are they maintained in a good condition? Is there damage? Are they impervious? In other words, they prevent microbiological or moisture retention? And are they functioning such that you would expect the correct levels of hygiene to be possible? I should add that the maintenance of walls has been a non-conformity, a common non-conformity for many years, and it's something that sites should be managing on an ongoing basis. The sixth most common non-conformity is clause 1.1.6, and this is another of the new clauses that were added for issue 8, and this relates to confidential reporting systems. A site must have a system whereby staff can report any concerns back to senior management, and that they need to be able to do that in such a way that they can do it without fear of any comeback to them. and so the system needs to be confidential. It needs to maintain the anonymous identity of the person doing the report. The site needs to have a mechanism whereby if a concern is reported, they assess that concern and see if there's any changes that need to be made. And obviously, if there are changes that need to be made, action needs to be taken. The management do need to communicate to the staff about what the process is for that sort of reporting. There are different systems that can be used. I'll mention one of those in a moment, but there must be a system in place to allow that to happen. And whilst we're talking about confidential reporting, BRCGS also like to receive feedback. We understand how important that is, and that sometimes staff or sites wish to provide feedback to us. So we have just launched our updated feedback system. We understand that the confidentiality aspects are as important for people talking to us as it is for the systems that sites have. And so we've got a system where the site can either report, or the individual can report either confidentiality or provide us with contact details at their discretion. And this new reporting system is live and available to anyone who wants to be able to use it. Feedback is possible in 9 languages and allows audio and video messaging when they are considered an asset by the person doing the feedback. There are 2 ways to access the system, either via our website or via a specialized email address. And we would encourage people to do that feedback whenever possible, or whenever they have something that they're concerned about the standards that they think we should be aware of. The final 4 non-conformities on our top 10 list are all clauses that were also part of issue 7, and therefore again are non-conformities that we've seen occurring for several years now, but sites still find challenging. So the first of these is 4.9.1.1. That's the clause relating to chemical control. And there are 2 aspects of this that I think sites find challenging. Ensuring that access to the chemicals is controlled. They should be kept in a locked area. And at any stage where chemical is decanted for use, for example, cleaning chemicals will often be decanted from a bulk container into easily usable containers. Those containers need to be labelled so that everybody is absolutely clear what there is in the container. And so labelling needs to be maintained. In number 8 is clause 4.4.8, and that's the condition of doors. And there are a number of things here that tend to lead to non-conformities. The condition of the door, pest proofing where that's needed, doors that are open when they should be kept closed, which may, for example, make pest ingress possible, or make other factors such as microbiological contamination, for example, from a lower risk area into a production area. Emergency exits that should only be used in a emergency, being used as a shortcut, and therefore circumventing product safety controls and changing areas. Lots of different things that can occur to lead to a non-conformity relating to doors. The ninth non-conformity I want to talk to you about is the internal audits. And we'll talk a little more about this in just a moment, but just to highlight that this is in a lower place than it was for issue 7. So I hope that means that sites are learning how to do good internal audits, how to schedule them properly and effectively, because internal audits are a really valuable and important tool. And the final non-conformity I just thought I'd highlight to you is a traceability clause, number 3.9.2. And this again is about identification and making sure every material, whether it's a raw material, whether it's a decanted raw material, whether it's an intermediate product, whether it's work in progress, whether it's a bulk product in store, whether it's a final product waiting to be packed, all of those need to be identified. And every material does need some form of identification and some form of traceability. And maintaining that obviously is an ongoing basis and a very important one. And so non-conformities sometimes occur against that clause. I said I'd like to say something a bit more about internal audits. Internal audits are one of the most powerful tools that a site has at its disposal. It allows the site to really look clearly at its own processes, at its own procedures, and ask itself, is it doing the right thing? And is it doing the thing that it said it must do? So, for example, if a process has been developed because of a food safety hazard, for example, the internal audit should look at that process and should be able to say, are we actually meeting our own process because we said it was important? It gives the site to make corrections and therefore improvements in the system. And that's obviously extremely important and extremely powerful in terms of continuing improvement, continuing maintenance of the quality management system, and continual review to make sure that product safety problems or concerns are less likely. From non-conformities in the past and from our own compliance audits, we were aware during issue 7 that many sites were still not effectively scheduling their internal audits throughout the year. Because where you have just 1 or maybe 2 internal audits of the system a year, it's likely that that will lead to a drop of standards between audits. And therefore, a proper schedule should have multiple audits throughout the year. The standard suggests at least 4, and that allows an ongoing audit program. One good way of completing audits is to split the whole quality management system up into multiple chunks and then identify different dates on which those pieces of the quality management system are audited. It's not necessary to have every single part of the product safety systems at a site audited at every single audit. For your internal audit program, there should be a risk assessment in place that identifies how frequently a particular process or a particular activity needs to be audited. That might be based on the sheer importance of that system or on previous audit history. So perhaps if there were non-conformities in the past, the auditing of a system might be increased until the site was confident that things were correct. So hopefully, as I said, this non-conformity is lower in the list than it was historically, and hopefully that means that sites are now developing and learning how to develop even better internal audit programs. So we ought to move on a little bit. There are a couple of areas which I wanted to highlight that can cause some confusion or some concern. And one of these was about the new section 411.8. Now, I'm glad to say it hasn't resulted in a top 10 non-conformity, but there has been a lot of discussion about it. There has been a lot of discussion about whether or not a risk-based system would allow some sites to identify that they don't need environmental monitoring programs, or that if they don't have a ready-to-eat product, do they still need an environmental monitoring program? So we are preparing some guidance. In fact, we're going to publish a position statement so that there's absolute clarity for everyone about exactly what this statement of intent requires and what we would expect a site to have in place, and what allowance there is to use that risk assessment. That position statement is currently in draft form and being assessed by our independent technical advisory committee, which consists of a large group of industry food safety specialists. We hope to publish it towards the end of January, and obviously more information will be available when that is published. This is probably a good time to mention that we do have a number of position statements already, and we will, as I've just said, add the one about environmental monitoring to it. Position statements can be found in two places. First of all, they're always added to the BRCGS Participate platform. They are also always added to our website, and that can be found under the BRCGS food safety tabs and in the help and guidance section. It is important that sites know where position statements are, because they can affect the implementation of the standard. They can explain how an audit will occur, or they could ensure, as they did for the one we talked about previously on clause 1.1.2, define how an auditor will assess and decide whether a major or minor non-conformity is appropriate. So it is important that sites know about the position statements and implement anything that is relevant to them. So just briefly to talk to you about the other two non-conformities we currently have. The first of these is about changing certification body for re-audit. Now, audit schedules are based on previous audit grade and will either be at 6 months or annually. And this is a process that's defined within the audit protocol. However, occasionally, a site will ask if they can have a re-audit shortly after a previous audit, rather than waiting the normal 6 months or 12 months. In that case, we've made clear what the rules are. And most importantly, that re-audit should be completed by the same certification body who issued the current certificate. In exceptional circumstances, then it may be possible to get permission from BRCGS to change certification body. Please note that that only refers to early re-audits. In other words, new audits immediately or very soon after an audit has taken place. It doesn't affect the 6-month or 12-month audits. Those normal audits continue to follow the rules in the audit protocol, and sites obviously in those situations have the right to decide which certification bodies they wish to use. But for early re-audits, immediately after an audit, this position statement applies. The other position statement that we published It is one just to clarify the position on production zones, i.e. high risk and high care, that is required for cooked crustacea. That's fully cooked, ready to eat crustacea, which of course in many parts of the world are eaten cold and without any further processing by the consumer. And we put this position statement out because we felt that there was some confusion or difference of opinions in different parts of the industry. It should be noted that a cooked crustacea is susceptible to pathogen contamination, and that if contaminated with a pathogen, a growth is possible, and therefore suitable controls are needed. And therefore we've highlighted that as a very minimum, if a site has good risk assessment and rigorous application of processes in place, that for the current time, a rigorous high care system might be acceptable. However, by issue 9, that's a few years away, but by issue 9, we would expect that cooked crustacea will be using high-risk facilities. Could I just highlight that on the slides, I've only put part of the position statements, and therefore you will need to refer to the full position statement document if you wish to check any of the details. So, just to finish our webinar today, I thought it was worthwhile just highlighting a few things that we know are coming in the future. We're not quite ready, so we haven't published them yet, but you will see one or two things later this year. So the first of these is we are going to make a small change to the audit report. A change to the non-conformity table within the audit report. Currently, within the non-conformities, it lists the requirement reference, the details of the non-conformity, the correction, in other words, the immediate corrective action that the site has completed, and then there's a column that says proposed preventive action based on root cause analysis. And that column currently is difficult, I think, for people to fill in really well, because it asks for a mixture of proposed preventative action and root cause analysis. And based on the first 10 months worth of audits, it's become clear that it would be preferable to separate those two elements. So, in the foreseeable future, probably from about the end of February, we're going to split those two topics, so there'll be a separate column for proposed preventive action plans and a separate column for a summary of the root cause analysis that was completed on that non-conformity. Hopefully that will then make that part of the report absolutely clear for everyone who's involved and who wants to assess that information. You will notice that as a consequence of that, the column that's talked about the evidence supplied to the certification body will no longer be in this table. The site is still expected to provide evidence of the closure of non-conformities to the certification body, and the certification body will still assess the suitability of that evidence to deal with the non-conformity that was raised, but they won't be recording that evidence within this table. The next thing that I just wanted to mention very briefly was the GFSI benchmark. In some countries, we know that the GFSI benchmark is really important to our certificated sites. And therefore, it's been an important part of our work to maintain our benchmarking to that standard. GFSI have highlighted that version 8 of their benchmarking requirements are scheduled to be released at their conference in February. We just wanted to mention that we are committed to maintaining our benchmarking, and therefore, once GFSI have published the document, we will of course be reviewing the information and ensuring that that benchmark can be kept in place. And the final thing I wanted to highlight was the fact that we have started to update our FAQ document. Obviously, we get asked many questions during a year, and often certain themes occur with lots of people wanting to have the same or very similar information. And therefore, we've created an FAQ document to have those common questions answered. We're just in the process of updating it. There'll be new information on high risk, high care. There'll be new information on the use of wood in factories, and new information on outsourced processing, and several other areas of the standard. And so we hope this will be a useful reference for both sites and auditors, and it will again be published on BRC Participate and on our website. So we hope that that will answer some of the questions that you have about the standard. Again, it's likely that this publication will be in February. And so that concludes our webinar for today. It just leaves me to say thank you for listening. I hope you found the information useful. We will continue to publish webinars during the rest of 2020 on subjects that we hope are useful to you. So do look out for our next webinar when it's published. And so thank you for listening, and goodbye for today.